Hello everybody, and welcome back to All Things Lord of the Rings. Happy New Year everyone, hope you all had a good one. So today's topic is going to be some of the big players in early elfdom. But first, retraction time. Elrond's being a contributor again, correcting me on the elven tribes. I was probably not entirely accurate about the Teleri in stating that some had returned to Middle-earth from Aman. While this may have happened after a fashion at a later time, there were initially no Teleri who naturally returned to Middle-earth from Aman. Some elves do come back, but that's for a later episode to discuss. He also pointed out that I'm leaving out a good deal of the background history of some of these clans, as it sounds like I'm saying the tribes were originally called Noldor and Teleri and Vanyar and so on. They had different names for themselves, and the new names mainly come about as a result of how they went about their journey concerning the trees. This is by design, I am afraid. While it is nice to know that the elves had a bit of their own organization going on before the Valar found them, it just isn't relevant to the narrative I'm trying to relate, and so I'm going to be glossing over a good amount of the minutiae of details, as I'm trying to appeal not to the fans who know all this already, but to the people who are just getting their toes wet. Also, there is some discrepancy about the number of years, but I'm going to save that one for a later video as well, as it kind of spoils something big that's happening soon, and I don't want to spoil anything. I like to hope that people are watching these vids and eagerly awaiting the rest of the narrative. I sure hope. Anyone? Guys? Back to the story. When Orome the Hunter went to fetch the elves, 3 representatives were chosen from them, and these 3 became the kings of the various major elven clans. Mind you, the Morroquendi were a rather diverse lot, and many clans existed completely outside of this setup, but they were mostly of little consequence in the doings of the West, and by West I mean Beleriand. Now, when I'm talking here about the 3 elven kings, I am not talking about the ones who wore the 3 rings for elven kings. The rings didn't happen until way into the Second Age, and we're barely scratching the First Age at this point. This is about the 3 original kings of the elves. Their names were Finwë, Ingwë, and Elwë. No, they were not brothers. Ingwë was the one who would eventually be the king of the Vanyar, and ultimately was regarded as the High King of all the elves. As the Vanyar pretty much made it their deal to stay in Valinor and bask in the radiance of the Valar, they never returned to Middle-earth or even set eyes upon it again. The Vanyar, while they are cool, have little relevance to most of the happenings of Middle-earth. Finwë would become the king of the Noldor, and he was a great deal more relevant to the happenings of the Ages of Arda. This is mainly because of his first son, Fëanor, who is going to get his own whole video all to himself. Miriel was the name of Finwë's first wife, and the birth of Fëanor pretty much did her in. She lost her spark, and not long after, died. Hers was the first death within Aman, and the only example I can think of an elf dying outside of battle, or not as a result of direct malicious intent by an outside party. Words, please. Though the loss of Miriel saddened him deeply, Finwë didn't want to spend his life alone, and got married again to a Vanyar lady named Indis, and had 2 sons, Fingolfin and Finarfin, and 2 daughters, Findis and Irime. Fëanor didn't really care for his father's second marriage, but the details are gonna have to be saved for the Fëanor vid. Suffice it to say, Fëanor was the greatest of Finwë's sons, by far. Elwë gets the longest cut here, because he had the most interesting life. He was the king of the Teleri, and one of the greatest elven leaders in Middle-earth history. He had help from his brother Olwë, but that didn't last, as I'm about to shortly explain. Olwë had some significance in the story of things, though, as he was Galadriel's grandfather, but she gets a vid to herself too, and that's about as important as he ended up being, to the overall narrative at least. Anyway, back to Elwë. En route to Aman and Valinor, Elwë stopped off with his folks in Beleriand, in a forest called Nan Elmoth. There he met an actual Maiar spirit who had taken an earthly avatar named Melian in the form of a beautiful lady. He was entranced by her. I mean it. Elwë actually stood there staring at her for 200 flipping years, I kid you not. This was a heck of a long absence, of course, especially for a Lord of the Elves, so Olwë took a bunch of the Teleri with him across the sea, and those were the ones who made the journey to Aman and Valinor. When Elwë finally returned, having married Melian, He had kind of an upgrade, so to speak. I should mention this is the first and only example of an Ainu of any kind actually marrying one of the children of Iluvatar. It was a pretty big deal, and some of her power rolled over into him, making him less than an Ainu, but more than an elf. He became much taller, actually the tallest elf ever. He gathered the remaining Teleria elves, who would from then on come to be known as the Sindar, or the Grey Elves, and founded the kingdom of Doriath. He also changed his name to Elu Thingol, mostly just called Thingol. He claimed lordship over all of Beleriand and ruled from Doriath with his wife. Later, they had a child together, a very famous child in the lore, Luthien Tenuviel, mostly just called Luthien, and her story is one of the greatest epics within the internal mythos of Middle-earth. A lot more happens with Thingol and Doriath, but that's for future episodes. I think I should also mention, because it doesn't really fit in very well on its own in any other video, that while the Valar did indeed capture and imprison Melkor, his works weren't completely stopped. The Valar never caught Melkor's top generals. There were two of them. First, GOTHMOG, the Lord of the Balrogs, and the baddest-ass fire demon ever to walk Middle-earth. Second, a name with which we will all be very familiar, Sauron. Now we're starting to see the connections to the villains we're familiar with entering the tale. Both of these lieutenants of Melkor's were Ainur, who had been in league with Melkor ever since the Ainu Lindale. Sauron's going to get his own whole episode, I promise, but of the servants of Melkor, he was inarguably the one who had the longest and most lasting effect upon the rest of history. Both of these generals still had command over the orcs and trolls and other little nasties of Melkor's creation, and they made life in the Eastern Lands pretty shit for anyone who still lived there. Also, Utumno, Melkor's great fortress. Torn down and blown open, destroyed. No place for evil to take a foothold, right? Wrong. Melkor was a crafty bastard, and he had another lesser-known stronghold much further to the north, called Angband. Utumno and Angband had a lot of very deep and very elaborate tunnels underneath them, linking up to each other, and the Valar didn't really stop to scour these tunnels, figuring that having captured Melkor, their job was done. It also didn't help that these tunnels were so secret and hidden that it was really going to be so huge a task to track them all that had the Valar even known about them, which is up for debate, it might not even have been worth it for them. Big mistake or oversight or whatever you want to call it, because Angband was the new hotspot for evil in Middle-earth, and the party hadn't even begun. But that's where we're going to cut it for now. Thank you all for watching. I am Alex, also known as Solanus Dracone, and this has been All Things Lord of the Rings. Goodbye.